Before we begin, drop a comment with where you're watching from. Today, we're opening one of the darkest files in American history, a mystery preserved in the dusty ledgers of Webster County, deep in Missouri's Ozark Mountains. Two sisters vanished into those ridgelines in 1882. What followed would unearth a nightmare hidden beneath the hills, a story of silence, caves, and a man who made the darkness his home. A routine trip that never ends. America was still stitching itself together after the Civil War. In the Ozarks, life meant distance, miles of oak walnut, and creek-cut hollows between one neighbor and the next. Roads were little more than wagon ruts. Mail might show up once a week, if the weather allowed. In late October, the Caldwell sisters, 23-year-old Margaret and 19-year-old Eleanor, told their father, Thomas, they were heading south from Marshfield to Springfield. Their aunt, Sarah Brennan, had written of a sudden illness and asked them to come. It was a 2-day wagon trip with a sensible stopover in Seymour. Thomas, a widowed hardware merchant who had already buried a wife, didn't like the thought of his daughters traveling alone. But Margaret argued they knew the road would make Seymour before dark and go on at first light. He checked the wheels, packed provisions, handed them a small pouch of coins, and warned them to stay on the main road. On the morning of October 28th, under a sky the color of pewter, the sisters rolled out in their best traveling dresses, woolen capes and broad hats behind a team of steady horses. Townsfolk waved. No one realized they were watching a goodbye. They never arrived in Seymour. The innkeeper who always saved them a room, Jeremiah Walsh, waited till 9 that evening, puzzled by their absence. In Springfield, Aunt Sarah waited through the 29th and 30th. On November 1st, she had a neighbor send a telegram. It took 2 days to reach Marshfield. By the time Thomas read it, nearly a week had passed. The search at first light on November 3rd, Thomas was in the saddle, driving his horse hard towards Seymour. There he found Walsh, who confirmed the worst. No sisters, no wagon. Men gathered on the muddy street, faces set. A farmer, Cornelius Black, had traveled that road on the 28th from Springfield northward. He'd seen no wagon with 2 young women. If the Caldwells left that morning, their paths should have crossed. Something had intervened. 15 riders formed a search party. They fanned out, calling the sisters' names into the timber until their throats burned. By afternoon, a young man named Peter Hutchkins spotted wagon tracks veering off the main road onto a narrow woodcutter's trail. The ruts were deep, recent, and led straight into dense timber. The men followed. They found the wagon overturned in a shadowed clearing, one wheel wrenched off, frame splintered, provisions scattered. The horses were gone, traces cut. Eleanor's cloak was snagged and torn in the brush. Margaret's shoe lay half buried in mud. The money pouch lay emptied. No blood, no bodies. Only the wrongness of a scene that spoke of force without any trace of where the girls had gone. That evening, someone mentioned an old hermit's cabin farther along a faint spur, a place folks avoided, wrapped in idle stories that, until that day, sounded like superstition. It was the only lead they had, the cabin. They pushed through heavy timber to the collapsed cabin. Fresh boot prints, large, heavy, circled the doorway. Inside, rotten cold. A blue scrap of cloth hung on a nail, Margaret's dress color unmistakable. Old rope with dark stains. Empty bottles. Nothing that told them where the girls were now. An old hunter, August Weber, suggested bringing his hounds. He returned with 3 scent dogs, letting them nose Eleanor's cloak and the blue fabric. The hounds seized a line and dragged the men southeast into a part of the woods even seasoned hunters avoided. Through ravines, across icy creeks, under hanging curtains of lichen. Then, suddenly, the dogs balked at a narrow valley with a black stream twisting through mossy rock. They whined and refused to go farther. On the opposite bank, drag marks cut through the mud and disappeared into a limestone wall broken by fissures, cave mouths. Into the mountain caves in the Ozarks are mazes, tight passages, dead air, and galleries where a man can get turned around and never see daylight again. But the sisters might be alive, and that was enough. Thomas, Cornelius, and a few others squeezed into the narrowest opening. Water dripped, cold breathed out of the rock. Their lanterns threw frail cones of yellow against slick walls. The tunnel forked, then forked again. Thomas followed the scuffed gravel where feet had worn a path. Then his light found something soft among the stones, Eleanor's prayer book, the one with her name inscribed by their mother. They pressed on into a chamber studded with dripping teeth of stone. A dead fire lay cold in the center. On one wall, tallies, bundles of 5, then 5 more, 63 days marked into the limestone. Not new, not from this week. In a shadowed corner lay a heap of belongings. Clothes, shoes, hats, a broken-lensed spectacles, a silver brooch with initials, a stopped pocket watch, and at the bottom, a yellowed wedding dress spattered brown. This wasn't a single crime. This was a harvest. A throat-low voice answered Thomas's call. Help! They found a second chamber, lit by a thin blade of daylight leaking through a crack overhead. A woman huddled against the far wall, barefoot, bruised eyes blown by fear. Not Margaret, not Eleanor. She flinched at light and then whispered, "He comes back." "We can't stay." Chains were set into the rock. One cuff hung open and scoured by frantic hands. The other held a cold, bruised ankle. There, behind a jut of stone, Thomas found Margaret, limp and chained, a bloody cut at her hairline. They broke the rusted link and lifted her free. The unknown woman rasped. The younger one had been taken deeper to the underground river 2 or 3 days prior. The river always takes. Thomas handed Margaret to Black and turned for the dark tunnel the woman had indicated. Hutchkins went with him, the river chamber. The descent grew steeper, the air wetter, the roar louder until the tunnel opened into a cavern so big their lights could not reach the far walls. A black river beat itself to foam against hidden stone. Torches jammed into cracks, painted the cave in flickering orange. A man bent over a body. He was broad, filthy, bearded, and moving with the terrible efficiency of someone who had done the same tasks many times. On the stone beside him lay Eleanor, bound and motionless. Thomas charged. The man turned, a pale mask of fanatic intensity, and smiled. He moved fast, tossing Thomas aside like a sack. Hutchkins tore a torch from the wall and slammed it across the man's back. Flames licked his oiled coat, but he hardly seemed to feel them. "They come to me," he said in a strange, educated cadence, madness shining in his eyes. "The mountains send them. I feed them. I keep them from being alone. And when they're ready, the river takes them." Thomas hit him again and again with a stone. The man laughed and lunged for Eleanor. Thomas tackled him. They grappled at the river's edge, boots slipping on wet rock. Hutchkins sawed through Eleanor's ropes. She stirred, alive. The fight slid toward the current. The man hoisted Thomas, and Thomas hooked a leg, twisting them both onto the rocks. The man's head cracked against a jagged spur. Blood sheeted down his cheek. His smile didn't break. "The river always takes," he whispered, and grabbed Thomas's coat for one last pull. Thomas clawed a rock and held. The man's fingers lost their strength. The river gripped him, and in a blink he was gone, drawn into the black throat of the cave. The rescue. They freed Eleanor and found 2 more women in crude cages, one lucid enough to stand with help, one unconscious and fevered. Hutchkins sprinted back to summon the others, while Thomas wrapped his daughter in his coat and waited in the damp cold, counting her breaths. By dusk, a line of men threaded back through the tunnels carrying the living on makeshift litters. They emerged to a bleeding sunset. At Walsh's boarding house in Seymour, lamps burned through the night as Dr. William Garrett treated gashes, infections, starvation, and shock. Margaret's concussion would heal. Eleanor's feet were torn, her body dehydrated, but she would live. The 2 other women were worse. One slipped away days later, buried as unknown beneath a simple stone. The lucid survivor gave her name, Catherine Morton of Indiana. She and her husband had been traveling to Arkansas in June. He was murdered at a campsite. She was dragged into the mountain and kept alive on roots and scraps. She watched others arrive and go to the river. A monster without a name, Sheriff Edmund Price organized a formal expedition. For 3 days, teams mapped the caves, cataloged artifacts, and sealed passages on their way out. They found more holding rooms with tallies clawed into stone. A living space with tacked-up shelves, stolen provisions, and mildewed books, including a Bible annotated with tight, frantic handwriting that braided scripture with private prophecy, purification, sacrifice, the river's judgment. They never found the man's body. The river had taken him too. Over the next weeks, churches were turned into ad hoc identification halls. Families came from across the Ozarks to look through trunks of belongings. A brooch with GH brought closure to a mother who had waited 8 years. A pocket watch cleared a groom-to-be who had lived under suspicion since 1877. The yellow wedding dress belonged to Elizabeth Whitmore. Missing since 1868, item by item, grief found names. Sheriff Price's final report in January 1883 linked 23 confirmed disappearances to the cave through physical evidence, with 15 more listed as probable. A St. Louis bone expert counted remains from at least a dozen victims. The true number, Price wrote, was likely higher. In the Ozarks, many vanishings were never reported at all. In February, work crews blasted and choked the cave mouths with rock. One small entrance was left barred and posted as a warning. Time and ivy swallowed even that. Aftermath. Marshfield lived under a new caution. Inns filled. Families insisted on escorts. The road that once felt lonely began to feel watched. The Caldwells tried to heal. Aunt Sarah recovered and moved to be near them. Margaret married a quiet widower and mothered his 2 children, and later her own, never letting them travel alone. Eleanor chose the classroom over marriage, teaching girls and writing private journals no one would ever read. Catherine Morton was taken home to Indiana, her mind shattered like glass. She died at 34, whispering about a river. Thomas sold the hardware store in 1885, moved north, and kept working with his hands in a quieter town. He died in 1912, thanking God for the years he got back. Margaret passed in 1941, Eleanor in 1947. Their stones tell no cave story, only names and dates, as if ordinary lives were all they knew. The legend mutated as legends do, into red-eyed giants and witches and vengeful spirits. The truth was uglier and simpler, a single human being, broken in mind, who chose evil and built a kingdom of control in the dark. Why we remember today, the official files sit yellowed in state archives. The sealed entrances are lost under brush and time. Cars hum along roads where wagons once groaned, hardly anyone sensing what lies beneath. But memory is a duty. We remember Margaret and Eleanor, who lived. We remember Catherine, the unknown red-haired woman, and the dozens more whose belongings spoke when they could not. We remember the officers, the hunters, the innkeeper who opened his doors, and a father who crawled into a mountain to bring his children home. Monsters are real, not the kind in stories, but the kind who write their own rules in places where no one looks. Vigilance is the answer, light is the answer, and telling the truth is the answer, even when it hurts. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. Help us keep pulling forgotten histories into the light. Leave a like to honor the victims, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Until the next story, take care and remember, even the darkest chapters deserve to be remembered.